Hi everyone, this is Ray Poynter here. So we're going to have a panel discussion with Melanie, Kristin and Seyi over the next 45 minutes, an hour and 5 minutes, however long it takes. So welcome everyone. And I think you can all see one of the people. I can see Melanie at the moment. Hi, Melanie. Oh, and that's great. And now we have Kristin, who is going to bring our first topic to us. So, Kristin, what are you going to talk about today?
I am going to talk about the future of remote work, which I know is probably a subject on everyone's mind these days, and probably particularly in the UK, as I know there were some announcements made about work from home in the last day or so. I think that it's a subject that I'm talking to a lot of CEOs about, and so I think it will fundamentally change the way that our industry operates, I believe, moving forward. I think it's still early to predict whether the work from home trend is going to persist in the same way post-COVID, but we do know the following. The ways that people work are changing, which you can see if you look at any statistics about the massive increases in Zoom usage. The nature of jobs and work will continue to rapidly evolve. On-demand work, I think, will evolve and become a bigger part of our global economy. And the relevance of tech-enabled multi-way synchronous and asynchronous communication and feedback is going to rise. So those are all trends that I'm seeing. I think it should also be noticed or noted, and we're seeing this occurring in our industry in many countries, that wages often rise in the aftermath of a pandemic and competition for talent increases. Now, whether that is, some mechanism of the disease culling workers, leaving survivors in a stronger position to negotiate opportunities, or as a result of pandemics exposing pre-existing inequalities, which can also lead to a significant increase in social unrest, which we've seen in some countries. So, there was a report that Women in Research put out along with ESOMAR and a number of other global partners, where we looked at the impact of COVID on both female and male workers in the industry. And one of the interesting things that we saw was that the hybrid and remote work are really the new normal for insights professionals. And it kind of brings into question whether going into a physical office every day isn't a broken way of working. And there was the really interesting article in the New Yorker a few months ago, where the entrepreneur Chris Hurd talked about the difference between knowledge work and this kind of the age where we were actually manufacturing products. So when knowledge work became a major economic sector in the 20th century, the necessity to have employees sort of work together around stationary machinery, because they're actually making things, as in the classic factory model, was curtailed. But there were secondary forces that preserved this co-location idea. So knowledge work requires collaboration and access to information, both of which were, sort of conveniently served when individuals were physically near shared conference rooms and filing cabinets. Now, most filing cabinets have gone away. We store everything on our computers, but companies had already at that point become familiar with this industrial idea of managers monitoring employees as they all sort of worked in the same space, really going so far as to adapt that standardized 9-to-5 work shift into the white collar world. So the result was the rise of what we might call the office as a factory model, the idea that whether the work is physical or cognitive, that we should gather in the same building to work together under close supervision during the same hours. And obviously the arrival of personal computers in the 1990s, followed by the spread of high-speed internet in the 2000s, really changed that status quo, and we started seeing companies allowing more flexibility in work. But then also some friction from companies like here in the States, Yahoo and Best Buy, which had introduced more flexible work arrangements, but then pulled workers back into the office, which is largely a factor of this misnomer that you can just give someone a laptop and an internet connection and set them off on their own, and those are the only connectivity tools that they need. I also think that it's why now, after 17 months of pandemic-induced building closures, so many large companies are looking to bring their office workers back just as soon as COVID infection rates make it feasible. But many employees are resisting that, and there's an interesting strategy there. And one of the things that I have suggested to companies is to consider a remote first strategy where relevant teams like sales and marketing or technology gather less frequently, maybe once a month as a good interval in varying locations that sort of suit the work being done. And because those meetings are relatively infrequent, there's no need for employees to live in the same city or even in the same region. And the real opportunity of that approach is that it significantly increases the size of the pool of potential hires. So if you look at a remote first company, they can access the best talent in the world, meaning you can literally hire from any region in any country. An office first company can only access those who live within a certain radius of their building. And that brings what I would consider a sort of Darwinian business dynamic into play. So say, for instance, Ray, if you and I are running companies competing in the same space and I have better talent and lower staffing costs, I'll put you out of business. And if I repeat that enough times with enough competitors, that remote first model will really rise to dominate market research and insights. And in a largely knowledge-based economy like research and insights, your value is the talent that you employ. If other companies employ better talent, then they are inherently better than you. And you can already see this beginning to happen in companies in our sectors that firms are abandoning long-term office leases and hiring better talent from around the world, and they're really reaping the rewards of that, of immediate profitability boosts and better hiring that those moves generate. So that's my position on remote work, and we can open it up for discussion.
That's great. Thanks, Kristin. And as Melanie has just said in the chat stream, if anybody else wants to put a comment in with that, that'd be great. I'm going to kick off with a first thought, which is, I wonder what's next, because I can see why this works for the talent pool we have. But what about the people who are currently undergrads and postgraduates who will be joining the industry next year? And Pete Cape has got this wonderful expression about how much of a lot of the learning historically has been done, which is you sit next to Nellie and she will show you how to do it. And you'll sit next to Joe and he will show you how to do it. And we're going to find that potentially more of a challenge, and similarly providing emotional, spiritual guidance, support to colleagues when you're not aware so much as you would be in a physical situation. Have you seen anybody start to tackle that? Kristin or Melanie or Peggy?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to what I said earlier, which is I think there's a misnomer that you can just give people a laptop and an internet connection and access to Zoom, and that's the only technology or any sort of thing that you need to worry about, that people will just do the same work from home. To your point, Ray, in the early stages of my career, I benefited greatly from sitting next to people and being able to ask questions. And that's why I think we're looking more at like a hybrid model where you do have some centralized office locations or people are getting together on a periodic basis. I just don't know that people will be going into an office every day like they were before. And that's why mentoring, training programs, having more access to I think coworkers in an informal basis is super important as we're bringing up that next generation of researchers.
Yeah, I've heard, we talk about this a lot, especially at some of our CEO summits. We talk about this quite a bit. And that, they say for sure that it's going to be a hybrid world. What they haven't figured out is how to create, a culture, how to have fun, how to create relationships in a fully remote world. So, and, we've all tried, we're even trying to have these like networking events at the end of our conferences, and they're not the same. And I don't know that they ever will be. Right. And so I do think that some of the training things can be solved, and they're talking about solving them now. Now, Zoom, you can share your screens and have your pictures up and see each other, and you can do something while the other person's doing it. You're sharing screens back and forth, and you have, your Zoom chat where you can ask quick questions, and not the same, of course, as walking down the hall and say, hey, I'm really struggling with this. Can you help me? But, it can't, those kind of things can be solved. But the week-long induction is still going to have to be done in person, I think. The times to come into the office and be together, and, the team events that you make time for just are going to have to be planned for. Also, this world has given everyone back quite a bit of their remote travel time when they were going in and out of the office. The goal, I think, is to get some of that time back and use it for some of these interpersonal skill development and meaning moments. So bottom line, I totally agree with everything Kristin's saying. It's going to go hybrid. There are still some things we have to figure out as we do this. But even if all of the CEOs wanted everybody to come back tomorrow when the government said it was okay, no one wants to. They don't want to go fully back in office full time with commutes to and from work every day. They felt what it's like to have a little bit more freedom and a little bit more time back in their lives. And even if everything returned to normal tomorrow, we're never going to go back to a completely factory office setting, I don't think, in our profession.
Yeah, but to look at the chat, I think Ed Keller makes a really good point, as does Annie, which is there's an incredible amount of privilege involved with people who are working from home successfully. Like in my case, I've been working from home for 15 years. I have a gorgeous big office with views of the mountains. I live in in an idyllic situation. I'm not in a tiny apartment in New York. I don't have children. So I'm not homeschooling. I've had some of my best months during the pandemic. It's quiet, like Melanie. I'm a little naturally introverted, and so for me, I have a great setup. But it's been a horrible time for a lot of women. Women have left the workplace in droves because the bulk of child and family care depends on them. Certainly folks that were working from small apartments or didn't have good internet access suffered for sure during the pandemic. So there's a lot of factors, I think, that play in, and Seyi may have a perspective on that, being in Africa, where I know in some regions internet is still problematic.
Well, overall, I do totally align with you, Kristin. Work from home, it's a concept that totally caught on very quickly. Of course, in 2020, we had no option whatsoever. We all had to work from home, so it wasn't an option on the table, right? And also, let's also bear in mind that for some other industries, like the IT sector, for example, 20 years, whatever, way back, they've been doing remote work because it's all about what you can deliver, and you can actually work from any location globally, from anywhere. I think what COVID-19 did was to bring it mainstream across all industries, and we all had to put a full stop to working from the offices. But I mean, there are a couple of teaching issues still that we have to definitely, we've seen at least from the African context, the issues around disconnection. Yes, it's very easy for you to be in a Zoom call, and actually you're wearing, you might even be wearing a shirt, but honestly you're wearing a short or your PJ under it.
Yoga pants.
Or you turn off your video. Absolutely, you turn off your video, and then you're basically sipping your favorite drink by the side, and you're totally disconnected from the whole conversation. So, in as much as I totally agree, there's some very fundamental things we still need to think about around the personal circumstances. And again, I think someone dropped it there on the chat box around new hires. It's not the same. I think growth for new hires or people having challenges with their career growth, more physical contact will be more useful to them than trying to work remotely. So it's going to have to be a blend, but what totally works at the end of the day would differ looking at the composition of the company itself. Maybe you have younger or new hires more than more experienced persons. It will also be that you need to think about the personal circumstances of the people that you're actually working with, things around mental health. because from disconnection, you begin to also look at, things around mental health. And of course, last year will be, you never have to now rethink the whole purpose of what the office you actually serve as. Maybe some sort of a clubhouse or some sort of, a well-prepped up hotel that we all work in or something at the end of the day. But I mean, those are conversations that are out there that we definitely need to consider.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of the whole accessibility, I think that's a really important conversation. When we were building some of our panels back in the day, remember we knew that we were underrepresenting people who didn't have internet, and so some companies went out and provided internet to the people that they wanted on their panel. The same is true here in this remote hiring model. We have to enable people who don't have those kinds of internet connections. That we're saving on office space with them. We're saving on commuting. We need to put those monies back into allowing them to have comfortable work, internet capabilities. And also, I'm seeing people hire in areas where they've never hired before because those people couldn't commute. So they couldn't commute to, these fancy offices in the downtown cities. They live out in the poorer parts of the world, or they're not located near a research corridor. And so there is an opening up of opportunity for people that may have never had an opportunity to commute into an insights office. So there's strengths and weaknesses, and we have to capitalize on the strengths and address the weaknesses, just like in every other transition we do in our business worlds.
Okay, we've got a wonderful set of questions out there, but we do need to move to our next topic. So we will try to blend them in as we move forward, but also, do continue to chat about those issues between yourselves as well, because we're going to stay with Melanie, and you mentioned accessibility there, so that's a great segue into your topic.
It is. Well, and accessibility is Annie's word. Thank you, Annie. Glad to see you online. So I do want to talk about idea priorities: inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. The next year, 2 years, 3 years are going to bring some important and immense change to our sector. When we talk about idea work at IA, we think about it in two big buckets. One is the research that we do, and the other is the teams that we build. And so we talked a little bit about teams. Everything in the team world is changing, from attracting to recruiting, engaging, retaining. The programs are all being reconsidered in light of diversity and team and culture. And when we talk about culture, remember we used to talk about culture fit. And one of the things that's really been a conversation lately is culture fit often means hiring the same type of people over and over again, but that just breeds bias in your hallways, and you're missing people. So now that conversation is moving to more about culture add, culture extension. What can someone bring to your team that will strengthen you and fill a void that you have in your team? And I think the core here is just measurement. We measure what we care about, right? So in the US specifically, we're measuring the demographic makeup of our profession right now. The work is in field right now to say how many women and men do we have, how many people of color, how many people of disability, and not just an aggregate, but at the introduction level, at the middle management level, at the executive level, and at the board level, and what do their pay ranges look like. And I'm so excited that that the US companies are saying, we're going to give you this data and we're going to let you build benchmarks. And then companies are going to be able to see how they compare to the benchmarks. But also we're going to put programs in place to watch those metrics change, hopefully over the next 3 to 5 years. I mean, Kristin knows this. But we're going to actually have the data to show what the gender looks like at the floor of the profession, and then what it looks like at the top, what the race and ethnicity looks like at the floor and what it looks like at the top, and what the pay gaps are by gender and by race, ethnicity. I'm super excited, but it also is going to, because we measure what we care about, we're going to care about the outcomes, and we're going to work to move them. So that we could talk about that alone for a while, but also just as important is the work that we produce. Everything is under review in terms of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access in our actual research practices. You guys know I am a bias nerd. I have the bias Codex sitting beside me. I look at it all the time. We have so much bias in our hallways. And a lot of it comes from just not having enough diversity of thought when we design, when we interpret, when we sample, when we analyze. So how we ask questions and the importance of understanding bias and microculture, making sure to ask questions of the right person, and not having that simplicity bias of using one question because it's easier to program, and having everybody have to have the same set of questions, but actually thinking about microculture and language and access to opportunity, and then how we sample and what representative means. What representative means meant just age and gender when, long ago, and then it became age, gender, ethnicity, and then age, gender, ethnicity, education. But now we have to think about culture and values and psychographics and points of view and these things that go on in our minds in terms of getting a really truly representative read. You can see that all over the polling. Anytime you see a polling miss, it's almost always because it was slanted in one direction, because the sample was not truly diverse and equitable and representative. And then finally, once you get those well-designed surveys and samples, you even have to think about the teams that are analyzing them, the teams that are telling the stories. Are they missing stories because they just can't connect the thoughts in their minds? They interpret the data through their own experiences. All of that is being considered. And I would love to hear from this group. What are you guys seeing in terms of idea concepts in investments, in tech, in research design, in staffing, and in calls for partners? What are you seeing? We're seeing a lot of movement, and we think it's going to be a real interesting 3 years.
I mean, obviously, this is a topic I spend a lot of time on, Melanie, as you know, because you're, Insights Association, great partner with Wire. So we're actually having our 15th anniversary next year, and every 5 years we do a kind of a benchmark of how we're progressing on DE&I in the industry. So it'll be an interesting year in 2022, I think, with lots of data. I think I put this in the chat, but I think neurodiversity is also a topic that, that we have to be able to address in our research. I think you kind of touched on that at the end there, Melanie, but I also think that for as much as I see people focused on it, I think one of my big concerns is that there's still a real lack of investment from companies on this topic. You see these big firms and they're saying they're committed to it, but then everyone that is working on those initiatives is doing it in addition to their full-time job. They're being asked to do it for free. And generally the people that are being asked to do it are the ones that are suffering the most because of the lack of diversity. It's women and people of color. And so I think if companies are really serious about it, they need to make an investment in it, and they also need to include it as one of their OKRs. Is it a measure of business performance? And if it's not a measure of business performance, then from my perspective, it's not going to get enough attention.
I love that. People ask, how do we get started? And I always tell them, think about those two buckets, your staff, your teams, and your research, and identify 3 key gaps in each. Create metrics around them and tie them to people's bonus and review outcomes. It's just that simple. Yeah. And really quickly, and then I bet Seyi and Ray have something to say. Someone in the chat asked me about the bias codex. Really quickly, I'm just going to share this picture. Can you see that? This is the cognitive bias codex. And if you were to just go around this and see things like we discard specifics to form generalities, we do that all the time in our work. But the problem is sometimes we discard specifics that are specific to a microculture that we're no longer representing. And when we do our readouts, we focus on the immediate. We avoid mistakes. We aim to preserve autonomy and group status and avoid irreversible decisions. We don't want to change our trackers because we prefer consistency over change. Like if you were just to spend some time on this cognitive bias codex and look at it through the lens of what might I have, going on in my teams and in my research, you'll be really enlightened. I love bias. So I know that I'm a weirdo that way. I love talking about bias. I don't love bias.
So I'll jump in quickly, and then Seyi, you follow me, please. Somebody in the chat stream asked, is this a US thing? No, this is many, many countries. I would certainly highlight, obviously, work done by ESOMAR and Kristin, but also Jane Frost in the MRS have been doing a wonderful amount of work looking at things like what does naturally representative mean, and also many, many different types of diversity. There's a quite interesting argument in the UK at the moment, which is talking about class. Most people who work in our industry come from a middle class background. Most people in the UK are not from a middle class background. So again, that is another source of tension. One final thing on that before I hand over is that the EU, the European Union, are proposing new legislation on artificial intelligence. One of the rules is going to be that your training set for AI will have to be diverse, and you will have to store that training set, and you'll have to make it available to inspectors to make sure that you haven't trained it on university graduates from leading US institutions, but actually you've trained it on the right people from the right countries, from the right backgrounds. So, Seyi, unfortunately, you're going to have to be Voices of Africa again, but I know that you've got several places and different coasts. So what's the experience there?
Right. I mean, Africa is an extremely youthful continent. We're talking about, on the average, 70% of Africans are less than 30 years old, or even more than that percentage. And then with internet penetration growing very rapidly, it does mean that the typical African worker is both very aware of the local conversations and of global conversations. However, there's some social cultural pullbacks, if I can say that, within the African context. I mean, it's historically very male dominated. But in the last decade or two, there's been a lot of conversation around, giving more power back, as it were, to the girl child, and then also giving, there be equity in terms of how, people get into roles, how people get promoted, how people get paid, and most of the corporate companies are, actually kind of pushing that agenda. In the last 10 years, there's been, women in power, there've been women leading corporations in Africa. So it's a conversation really catching on, as it were. What might be a lot more slower in catching on in Africa will be things around the sexual orientation. In a lot of African countries and markets, it's still it's still a criminal offense to talk about I'm gay, I'm lesbian, and all of that. And so when you talk about the wordings of our questionnaires, it's pretty much straightforward: male, female, right? You don't go beyond that, right? Again, if we begin to now drill down into microcultures, again, the context of being married totally then becomes not something that can travel around. And in particular with the African continent. But, just staying within the market research industry, there's been a lot of conscious effort to bring women, in terms of recruitment, in terms of promotion, in terms of leadership, into more roles, into more visibility, and of course, in terms of how, pay and leadership actually works out, it's growing, but definitely maybe not like other parts of the world.
Great. So Melanie, anything to add before we move to the next topic?
Just that I love what you said about even the demographic questions. I know there are a lot of groups doing advanced research right now. I think it's going to be really important that we agree on a path forward on gender. The old and I come from a sampling world, so I come from a place of empathy here, but the old, saying of we can only ask male, female because that's how our quotas are set and we get our quotas from the census. We're going to have to find ways to address that and to move past that. And because we're trading, again, one bias for another, we're trading a consistency bias for an inclusion bias. And which is more important, probably inclusion and representativeness, and find ways around the other demographics and quotas and weighting. And so weighting, I know, means anyway, we could talk about that analytically, but we're going to have to find
I was like, wow, that's a rabbit hole you're going down right
no,
now.
I'm not. I stopped myself. I paused. Never mind.
Step back. Step
But I
away
mean,
from the hole.
There is
Yeah.
a chat. There's a couple comments here also that maybe going back before we move on about mental health. Mental health is a real thing. Like my daughter works from home most of the time, and she's going through some pretty tough things, you know, in terms of her family's going through some things. She's got young children. Her mental health is suffering as a result of this new world. And so I don't know if you guys want to talk a little bit more about that, but mental health and what it's doing to people in this new world, both by forcing people back into the world and by forcing them to stay home, really having a dramatic impact on people.
I mean, let me just quickly jump in on that. And that's what I was talking about, you know, that feeling of feeling disconnected. That sense that people do get with the virtual world, and then the fact that it totally leads to, you know, issues around mental health. I remember in 2020 during the lockdown, we tried to create some semblance of emotional, connection moments with the team. You know, every meeting will start with trying to find out how people are doing, you know, what's wrong, you know, how you're coping and all of that. We even tried virtual parties, you know, town hall meetings, but they were not close to having one-on-one contact, feeling that person, being able to hug that person, being able to pour out your heart to that person, because you can, you know, there's that empathy that flows quite naturally because we're humans, right? So, I mean, hybrid work will still come, but it has to be something carefully, executed, because at the end of the day, humans are made for connection. We're not made for disconnection. We're made for connection.
Yeah, we were talking about this before. I think we actually started the webinar, but I would like to be a cautionary tale to everybody on this call that, you know, as somebody who traveled very frequently prior to the pandemic and speaks a lot and is a networking machine, you know, my first real business trip post-COVID was 49 days, you know, 4 or 5 countries, back to back events. And this is a routine that I've followed for, you know, the last 15 years of my career with no problem. And I have to say that I was absolutely laid out and exhausted. And one of the things I realized was that it wasn't just the travel, it was like the always being on and the face-to-face networking, like I just was not used to it. And so I would say, you know, if you're going to hit the road again, like I have been, be gentle with yourself. Maybe don't schedule 3 or 4 conferences back to back and dinners and drinks every night.
Yeah. Well, and love languages, people connect to people in different ways. One of mine is physical. I really love to be hugged. Like I cannot tell you how much I miss just being hugged. I'm not getting enough hugs in my life. And that sounds probably silly, but it's
I totally identify with you, Melanie.
What?
I totally identify with you.
It's actually a physical need for me, and I'm not getting enough, physical hugs from people anymore. And there are a lot of people like me in the world.
Okay, with
life is
the hugging moment,
when there's connection.
We are going to move on to the final topic, and we are going to, Seyi and I, address 2 sides of the same topic. The topic itself is the enormous change in the industry that's going on in terms of the use of self-serve or DIY platform, depending on whether you're in favor of them. They're self-serve. If you don't like them, you often call them DIY. The shift to democratization, if you like the process, where more and more people are utilizing research and they're conducting research, or monkeys with dynamite was the alternative point of view a few years ago from people who thought it was a bad idea. But it's an idea that has happened. There are now thousands of platforms available. And a study that was partnered between the Insights Association, ESOMAR, and a number of other groups, we did a worldwide study, and it's about 50% of all research projects are now conducted internally by clients, but increasingly not by the insights team. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is happening inside the client organizations and the platforms. And then Seyi is going to talk about what agencies need to do, what skills, how do we respond? And then we will see what everybody else has. So it's not a question of should this happen or not. This has happened. It is happening. It's going to be bigger. The question becomes, how do we make sure that we get the right quality, that the research is useful? Because there are some real benefits in this. If somebody who has to make a decision is shifting from being driven by their gut to being driven by evidence, that is fantastic. If a decision maker is able to get answers quickly themselves, then that research is much more likely to be implemented. One of the great sadnesses of the last 45 years of my life in market research is how often great research was not implemented because it was too far away from the point of use. If we've got more people who are at the point of use doing it safely with the right tools, with the right platforms, then it can make all the difference. One of the key things we need to do is make sure that it's robust. There's a wonderful word in Japanese, daijobu, which means it's sound, it's strong, it's okay. We want to make sure that our research is like that you can take a few liberties and still get something really reliable out. And we need people to understand when it's a special case, when you need to bring in the experts. So yes, you can cut your own toenails, but you probably shouldn't cut your own hair. You want to bring in a specialist. So that's what we need to be doing on the provider side. Seyi, what are your thoughts about the skills agencies really need to grow and change?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts around that, Craig. I think that's a fantastic introduction to the fact that looking into the future, self-service platforms will keep growing. I think, if I'm correct, the ESOMAR report points in the direction of 30% growth year on year, though from a small base, but definitely still growing. And then that gives us some sort of direction of how the future is going to be shaping up. I think number one will be that we must become multi-platform experts and facilitators. We must take the lead. We must be able to help our clients facilitate the usage of platforms, whichever one they are comfortable with. And then, we should also then bring our frameworks to make better sense of the data they are getting. I mean, most often than not, a lot of them will run self-service kind of work, and then they still have to give you a call and say, you know what, I think I'm having a problem trying to interpret this and make it suitable, as it were, for all the user departments that I have to report this thing to. Number two would be something so obvious. It's been in the front burner for us as an industry for a while, and that's storytelling. Right. I mean, bringing analysis together and insights in a very compelling manner that inspires, that engages, and then that, kind of provoke action from the end users. It's something that we definitely have to become really, really good at, looking ahead. I mean, there was a story I read of some work done, I believe in Spain, where the agency had to create a house. The client is a technology company, and then they created a house, and then they fitted a house with suits where they couldn't hear well, they couldn't see well, they couldn't move well. And they were able to bring, as it were, the old findings to bear very powerfully, to the end user. So it's looking like we need, our teams has to be really diverse, from documentary, filmmakers to anthropologists, to even set makers and all of that. And then just writing on that, I've always been big on the fact that we need to totally move away from the silo of saying I'm a qualitative, I'm a quantitative. As a client, I really do not care whether you're a qualitative expert or a quantitative expert. I have a problem and I need a solution to it. And I think that's where consulting comes to play, where we focus on the problem for our clients, not, the tools we've developed over time, not the fact that I'm a qualitative researcher, not the bring, all data sources together, not just the primary data we've collected, where we can own the analysis. We don't need to boil the entire ocean to get to the solution. I remember when my very first job, when I started research 20 odd years ago, I was, a whole truckload, as it were, of data was printed out, and I was supposed to go through, that. Gone are the days where clients are looking for 200 slides. They're looking for how can I get to the story quite quickly? So what? And that's then put a lot of pressure on us to totally develop our commercial judgment. We need to be able to speak to clients in the language, in the way that makes sense to them, not as a researcher, not in terms of the data, but in terms of impact on the business. And the last point here will be that, it's quite obvious, but again, I will just reiterate it, is that we need to become learning machines, where we learn, we unlearn, we relearn. And why do I say that? The world as we know it today is still just unfolding. What we know as big data today, 90% of it just got created in the last 2 years. So let's fast forward in our mind the next 5 years. It's a world that all of us, we don't know at all. Every second, 127 devices get connected to the internet. Internet penetration globally is 60% as we speak. Every 18 months, computing power doubles, and so even the world that is unfolding and the ecosystem that we now belong to, which is the broader insight, it's something that we're all learning. So, lastly would be the fact that we just all have to become learning machines, where we're very adept at learning, more than being, stuck on the ground on what we know, but rather layering and learning and evolving as things are actually panning out in the new normal.
So I'm going to grab the opportunity to disagree with somebody, and this is going to be Kristin, which is always great when I think the panel can disagree. Maybe almost anybody.
I love disagreeing with you, Ray.
Yeah. Actually, sometimes it's quite heated, but can anybody write a survey? Now, I don't think that most people in our industry can actually write a good survey, and I don't.
Well, that's clear. I don't think most people in our industry would even take their own surveys.
Yes, and I don't think that the future is to enable more people to write surveys. I think the future is to enable them to ask a system questions and the system to generate, here are 3 or 4 ways of solving that problem. Which one of these do you want to use? And if you want to change the questions, that's when it flies up a question saying, okay, do you know what you're talking about? Or do you want to go and talk to an expert before you change the questions? Because there's a reason why we've got that 0 to 10 scale for the NPS. And it's not the reason you might think, it's simply so we can benchmark it. And I think we're going to move away from most professional researchers writing questions. And I certainly don't want to start getting people who are busy doing other things writing surveys. And I think from Melanie's previous incarnation at Dynata, you'd have seen some pretty awful surveys from professional market researchers.
Yeah, more bad than good, honestly. But, I love what's kind of going on in the chat. Look, there is a place for all of this. DIY, DIT, and DIFM, right? So there's do it yourself. I think that there's a place for that. And I think that the technologists, the need is to just build some of these mind of the researcher into the tech. You guys have heard me say that before. Build guardrails, don't let people run advanced analytics on n equals 10, right? So build them questions that are well designed, build guardrails around the sampling, give them example demographic questions and example sample plans to make sure that it's representative. So there are things that can be built well, and that good marketers can do good research. But then there's DIFM. Do it together. I'm gonna start it, and then I'm gonna let an expert person come in and help me not only review what I'm doing, but help me when it comes time to actually interpreting. And then there's do it for me. There's, I need deep surgery.
Right.
I cut my hair and I messed it up real bad. I'm going to need you to fix it. Right. There's going to be these other things that really require a team of experts to give the right kind of guidance. Look, the consulting groups grew, the consulting sector grew 22% last year in the midst of all of this pandemic. And it's because they're experts. And not only do they tell you how to do the great research, they tell you what the hell to do with the research when it's all done. And they make damn sure that you get business impact from the exercises that are being run. That's where we really provide our value. And if we're providing business impact that's quantifiable to the balance sheet of big companies, we're never going to have to worry about DIY taking our jobs.
Yeah, that's totally true. I think, 2 points to address what Ray was saying. I mean, I think there is a rise, fortunately, in micro surveys where people are asking 1 or 2 questions. And those are cases where I think do you need to be an expert to fill the micro survey? Maybe not. You're just trying to get a quick answer to 1 or 2 things. The second is that I think that, and this is something I think we agree on, Ray, is that the amount of survey questions or primary questions asked is decreasing as there's more behavioral and other types of data that is perhaps more representative of actual behaviors is available. And, it makes me think of a conversation I had with Pavi Gupta, who also ran for SMR Council. And he and I were having a conversation. This is when he was at Johnson & Johnson. He's at SC Johnson now, totally different company, just to make it super confusing. But he was saying when he was at Johnson & Johnson, he had a report that he had submitted to marketing, and the CMO came in and said, this report is great, but sale data, or what about this type of data? And Pavi was like, well, I don't work with those data types. I do survey data. I'm a market researcher and I run surveys. And then, the CMO left. Pavi went home and he said, I got home that night and I thought about it and I realized that if I didn't learn how to work with these other data sets, I wasn't going to have a job in 5 years, maybe less than that. And so he gave a really interesting presentation. I'm sure it's online somewhere for TMRE, where he kind of talked about how he integrates these different data sets and how he's working with different types of data to get more meaningful insights. And I think that is an area as an industry where we have been very, very slow to adopt and understand how to work with those other data sets. And to Melanie's point, provide more strategic insights. Like when we're getting knocked out of engagements by big consulting, it is because we're not taking a more holistic view of the business. We're looking at things on a project by project basis instead of looking at, big consulting is coming in and they're having very strategic conversations about what is going to drive company growth and profitability. And, it's like, I've been saying this a lot lately, but Chris Burggrave was a keynote at SMR Congress a couple of years ago in Edinburgh. And he said, we need to, think like a CFO and present like a CMO. And that's really important, I think, for insights. And I'll just give one more SMR plug really quickly. This whole democratization of research and, some discussions around qualitative versus quantitative. SMR is actually running 2 events next week. We've got a qualitative exchange coming up on December 14th. And future proofing and foresight on December 15th. And we are going to be talking about the democratization of research in both of those discussions. So those are open and for registration on the SMR site.
So we have a few minutes left. So if people would like to throw a question to the panel, now's a great time to do that. But and while you're doing that, Seyi, would you like to sum up on that topic for us?
Well, sure, Ray. So ultimately, I think what we've all agreed about this conversation is that the landscape has shifted. So it's about, we also need to begin to look at where we deliver the most value and how we can deliver the most value to clients going forward. Kristin talked about, having that strong commercial sense, being able to have our highest focus as consultants because that's the way the management consultants actually think. They think about the end commercial value to the client, not so much about project by project engagement with the clients. And then again, it's from our conversation, it's so clear that this data triangulation is going to be really powerful. So we need to begin to see how all other data sources can begin to come into play, where we give a 360-degree view of the problem to the client. And again, we're not going to fight platforms. We're just going to become experts at platforms. We will go to the end of the value, the peak of the value, where we actually can help them with interpretation, with use, how we can, break it down into bite sizes for the different user units or departments in the business, with razor focus on the commercial impact on their business. So it's interesting times ahead, really. And storytelling is something we've talked so much about, but I think we just got to do it, and then find very creative way to make our conversation with clients extremely experiential and unforgettable.
I think that's a great point, Seyi. Somebody talked about the CX silo in the chat stream, and we have researchers who measure customer experience. I don't know whether there are many market researchers who are really thinking about the customer experience we create for our customers. Are there agencies around, Melanie, Kristin, you might know, who have a chief experience officer from the age? Okay.
Yeah.
Shout out, Kristin. That's
Mesh. Yeah, Mesh Fiona Blades.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And she is, she's very, very focused on that. If you know Fiona Blades, she's like a total dynamo. And she is focused on that. Yeah, absolutely.
And then another title in that same area is customer success. Some people use that in a sales role, but there are companies who actually call it a customer success leader, and their whole job is about end-to-end customer experience and making sure that they have successful engagements. So there's not enough of them, to be clear to your point, but yes, there are some. Yeah,
I tend to see customer success in a slightly different way. When I'm coaching it, it tends to be, your job is, okay, who buys the research from Eximo? Sally at Eximo buys the research, right? Your job is to make Sally successful in Eximo. If you do that, everything else is going to go right. So find out what she needs. How can you make her look good? How can you make sure she doesn't make a mistake? How can you cover her back? And I see customer success more in that way. Clearly, the experience is going to be an important part of it. But no, I think that's great what you're saying there, Melanie. And yes, Fiona would be an extremely good example. So just having a quick...
While we're waiting, I wanted to kind of come back to a point I put in here about, I want to come back to this idea of the work that we do. I put in the chat that we tend to give our power and our success away to other departments. We create new products, but we give that win to the product team. We create new pricing structures, but we give that pricing outcome and success to the finance team. We help them create new brand attributes and brand, and then we give that success away on the marketing value to the marketing team. And it's not to say that we shouldn't be great business partners for those other departments. We should be, but we should be tracking every one of those outcomes as KPIs to the balance sheet and celebrating them and having success about them, and talking about them as a chief financial officer would. What did your team do? Don't say we ran 27 projects and we implemented a new tool. Say we grew the revenue of product X by 37%. We grew the value of the brand by 26%. Those are the languages that we need to use. And if we're using those languages, it means two things. It means we're actually proving business impact and designing the work right to have the business impact, and we're adding value to the balance sheet in ways that the CFO and the CEO and the CMO can really wrap their minds around and support and give us more resources.
So I'm going to pick up on something that Mike Sherman has put into the chat stream, which I certainly agree with, which is storytelling is a means to an end, which it's often a good means. Engagement is often a good means. visualization is often a good means. But the end comes back to what Melanie has just said. Did we help the company sell more stuff? Did we help them keep more customers? Did they help them get more business? That's what we've got to be evaluated on. That's what we have to deliver, are answers that generate those results by whatever means is the best way of getting those across. Now, at the moment, storytelling will often be an important part of that. But we've all been in a situation where there's been really nice storytelling, but no substance. And you feel happy at the end of the meeting, but you don't give them another project, in my experience. Right, okay, I think we've covered the vast majority of things. We're getting lots of nice comments in the chat stream. So thank you so much, Kristin, Seyi, and Melanie for joining us. Recording, finding, so I'm actually going to be very little on the scene for the next few months, partly a COVID change, partly a lifestyle change. I turned 65 in October, so I'm going to be using my resources differently. I'm spending a lot more time running ultra races, but I'm going to be writing a new book, finding and communicating the story in the data. So I'm going to be running some webinars in the first part of the year, talking about progress with the book. I'll be inviting people to come along and help if they want to with that. And I'm committing to that being out in the middle of the year. In fact, in my calendar, it says June, and I believe in my calendar. Thank you once again to all of the speakers. And that's the end of today's broadcast. So stay safe, stay happy, and make sure you spend time on you and those near you. Bye for now.